In this episode, we'll take a look at the Shure SLX-D wireless microphone system. Here we'll take a look at the SLX-D wireless microphone system, a brand new system from Shure. Now, there are a few things for those of you that are enthusiast filmmakers, and even those of you that do narrative film production, you probably haven't really worked a lot with Shure Wireless, and that was the same for me. But Shure Wireless has a long history in a lot of different locations like theater, venues, installations, things like that. So we don't see it as much in like location sound, but this is a particular system that could be useful for people that are doing studio type of work. So if you're shooting YouTube videos and you're ready to move up to a wireless system that's very reliable, this could be worth looking at. Now, as far as the marketing for the SLX-D digital wireless microphone system, they actually cite a number of examples: lecture halls, house of worship, so churches, conference rooms, event stages, community theater, and performance venues. So this is really sort of one of their mid-tier wireless microphone systems. They have some lower tier systems that are 2.4 gigahertz. This one actually operates in the UHF frequencies, and we'll talk about that in just a second and why that's important and why that's a major advantage. Now, let me reiterate here, this is not a system for attaching to the top of your camera. No, and it is also not a system for putting in a sound bag. And the reason for that is the receiver is actually half rack size. So it's something you would put on a table or you would mount in a rack. And so that's the important thing to remember. So this is really for special use cases. For me as a corporate video shooter, I could definitely use this because a lot of times I'm working in the office where I have the luxury of having AC power where I can attach it to. It takes a DC 15 volt input, so you could probably rig something up to a battery system on a cart, for example. I think you probably could use it on a cart, but if you're in a bag or if you're planning to put something on top of a camera, this one's out. Let's talk about one of the very most important features of this system. It is a UHF system. That means it transmits between 470 megahertz up to 930 megahertz roughly, depending on the particular locality where you're using it. So in the United States, for example, it goes from 470, depending on which kit you buy, up to, I believe, 608 megahertz. So you can buy a variety of different blocks within that range. And the first question people will ask, well, why would I want to use those old-fashioned UHF? And I think what happens is people get confused between analog systems and the frequency at which you're transmitting. They are not the same thing. So let's talk about that in a little bit of detail here first. So first of all, UHF simply refers to that frequency range I mentioned before, the 400, in the case of the United States, 470 to 608 megahertz. That's different than, for example, Wi-Fi or a lot of the consumer digital wireless systems which operate at 2.4 gigahertz, which is much higher up in the frequency spectrum. Now, what's the big difference between those? Why not just use 2.4 gigahertz? It's just simpler. It's available for unlicensed use. Wi-Fi uses it. It's good enough for Wi-Fi. Why don't we just use that? Well, the fact of the matter is that just based on the laws of physics, you can get a signal to propagate better at UHF frequencies versus 2.4 gigahertz frequencies. And in fact, you'll see later on in our distance test with this system, at a much lower output power, I was able to go much farther than a lot of the 2.4 gigahertz systems I've tested, especially when you're working outdoors. Those systems tend to just fall to pieces very quickly outdoors. A UHF system holds up much better in those cases. And also, when you have barriers on set, for example, or wherever you're working and shooting, then I think UHF is almost always going to have a better chance of making it from the transmitter to the receiver. So if you're doing paid work, that's where things like this really start to matter. If you're just making YouTube videos or making films with your friends, of course, go with the consumer systems. That makes sense. You're self-funding. You don't necessarily have as much of a budget. But when you have a little bit more budget and you need the reliability, something that transmits in the UHF frequency ranges is a lot more useful and a lot more reliable. One of the other things that makes it more reliable as well is that you're working with a larger frequency range. So 2.4 gigahertz is a very narrow slice, actually. In the United States, for example, the 470 to 608 is a much larger range. And so if one frequency isn't working, you have the opportunity to scan and look for another frequency within that range, and you can move to that. When you're working with 2.4 gigahertz wireless mic systems, your only options really are to increase the output power or to increase the latency on the system so that you give the system more time to resend the packets of data, sound data, that it's lost in the transmission. And the latency is definitely not like the ideal solution because then you're going to have your wireless mics out of sync with your boom mic and your wired mics, and you can actually fix that by applying a delay in your mixer or recorder, but it just complicates matters some. And even when you increase the power, for example, I think on the Deity Connect system, you can go up to, I can't remember if it's 50 milliwatts or 100 milliwatts. I think it's 100 milliwatts. Even that doesn't always solve the problem. In fact, outdoors, it didn't help at all in some of our tests. So it's really important to understand this distinction here between UHF and 2.4 gigahertz and the advantages and disadvantages. So the next question you might ask is, well, what makes this more compelling compared to something like a Sennheiser G4 system? The Sennheiser system is an analog system. And so as an analog system, it actually has to do something called companding, which what companding does is it captures the microphone signal in the transmitter, and it actually has to compress it so that it can send it, and then it expands it once it gets back to the receiver. And there can be artifacts introduced doing things like that. So while the Sennheiser G3 and G4 systems actually sound pretty good to me, it's not the same as a digital system. And that's where something like the SLX-D, which is a digital system, is quite a bit different. So the advantages there are that you get a much broader frequency response, so from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz. So that could potentially improve your audio quality. And then I also find that the SLX-D is a little bit easier to actually set up. So when you're doing the scan, which is what you have to do with all the systems that are wideband in the UHF frequency range, you do have to scan and find a frequency that's open, that it's not being used by something else, because you are sharing these frequencies with television stations, for example. So you have to find a frequency that is open, and once you've done the scan on the receiver, then you have to get that frequency you've chosen into your transmitter as well, so they're talking on the same frequency. That process is actually quite a bit easier, in my experience, on the SLX-D system versus a Sennheiser system. And that's especially true if you add additional channels. So you can actually do some kind of basic frequency coordination here, whereas with the G4 system or the G3 system, you're kind of on your own to do that. Not a big deal if you're just using a couple frequencies, but once you start getting up into 5 and 6 and more, it gets a little bit more tedious. All right, let's run through the pros and the cons of the SLX-D system. From my perspective, I've had it for a little over a week, so I'm really just kind of getting my feet wet at this point, just so you understand where I'm coming from. It's not a super in-depth, and because we're still in the middle of a pandemic, I haven't used it on any productions yet, just in my own testing around home here. It does transmit 24-bit digital audio, and depending on where in the world you're using it, or where you buy it actually, it operates somewhere between the 470 and 937.5 megahertz range. So here, for example, as I mentioned before in the United States, that's 470 to 608. You'll notice that the receiver does have 2 antennas, so it does do digital predictive switching diversity, so that if one of the antennas isn't working so well, it switches to the other. And it does this all automatically behind the scenes. You never notice it. And I found that it does result in a very reliable connection. In the specs, they do say that the body pack transmitter, which is the SLX-D1, has a 120 decibel dynamic range, which is pretty impressive for a wireless system at this price range. Again, we're talking about less than $1,000 per channel, so pretty impressive there. Of course, that's going to depend on the microphone you use with it. In this video, we're recording the entire thing with the SLX-D wireless microphone system. I have the Shure Twinplex TL47 lavalier microphone just up here under the button placket of my shirt. That's going into the SLX-D1. These model numbers are a little bit difficult to remember. That is the body pack transmitter. That's going to the SLX-D4, which is the half rack mount receiver, which is actually sitting on top of my bag on my sound cart here. And that's going into the Sound Devices 888, so that's what you're hearing here. Next up here is a practical noise floor sample for you. In this sample here, we're recording with the SLX-D wireless microphone system. Of course, I have the SLX-D1 body pack transmitter on my belt on my back here, and then feeding into that we have the Shure Twinplex TL47 lavalier microphone. It's mounted on my chest, basically here in the center. pretty traditional spot for video production. And then this is transmitting, of course, over to the SLX-D4. It's a single channel receiver for the SLX-D system. Then we're running an XLR microphone out of that at line level into my sound device's 888 mixer and recorder, and that's what you're hearing right here. We haven't done any sort of post-processing on this. I want you to hear what it sounds like directly out of the recorder. All we've done is normalize it to -23 LUFS, and that's what you're hearing. Now in this room, we have sound blankets hanging to either side of me, one back by the camera, a rug underneath me, a blanket on the floor behind me. Otherwise, we have a concrete floor and a concrete wall behind me, just so that you can get a sense for the space here. And I'll stop talking here for just a few moments so you can hear what the practical noise floor sounds like. In our practical noise sample, when we measured the silent portion, that came in at -68 dB RMS total. So overall, very clean for a wireless system, and definitely something that I would trust. In our distance test outdoors, which we'll show you here in just a second, our first dropout occurred at 100 meters. This was with the transmitter power set to high, which is 10 milliwatts. And let's go ahead and roll that for you. 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. All right, sun's right in my face. I'm over here. I don't know if I'm on camera. I think I'm on camera. And how are we doing in terms of dropouts? No dropouts yet. Okay, very good. So here's 25 meters walking. It's probably not, as the crow flies, we're probably more like 20 meters. But we're going to keep going here. 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 40 meters here. 40 meters, how are we doing? We're still good. No dropouts. Unreal. Didn't expect that. Okay, let's keep going. 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60. We're still good, no dropouts. Okay. Well, I'm going to be walking off frame here, but we're going to keep going for a while. So here we go, we're at 60. 60, right? 60, okay. 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75 meters. Still good? Okay. 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100 meters. We had a drop. Okay, so I'm going to come back. I'm walking back right now, back up the road. So we did have our dropout. Now, that is completely expected from my point of view. But I think we're doing surprisingly well for outdoors, where the wireless signal just kind of goes everywhere. And we're walking our way back here. Pretty soon here we'll be coming into picture. Still coming. Are we back on? Okay. So we're evidently picking up right now, making our way back to the camera position. Now, the transmitter is a little bit interesting from the standpoint that you have a couple of different powering options. Of course, you can use regular AA batteries, alkaline, nickel metal hydride, lithium, but they also have a proprietary battery that fits in, which is a rechargeable lithium-ion pack. And in addition to that, it has some contacts on the front and some optional docking stations where you can actually just slide the transmitter into the docking station, actually two transmitters into the docking station, and it will actually recharge those lithium-ion batteries. So you get a number of options there in terms of how to power this. We just use traditional nickel metal hydride rechargeable batteries. In fact, they're IKEA, I think they call them Lada batteries. They are rated at 2,450 milliamp hours, and I was able to power the body pack transmitter set at low power with two of these batteries for 10 hours and 47 minutes. So it did really, really well. And that was part of the time with the transmitter in pretty close proximity to the receiver. I'd say maybe 10 feet or so, maybe 3 meters. And then we also put it upstairs while the receiver was downstairs. So that actually had to go through a couple of walls. I don't know that, if that taxes the system a little bit more. If I had to guess, it's probably taxing the receiver a little bit more. But nevertheless, hopefully something that was pretty close to real world. I would say the transmitter was probably 20 meters away when I had it upstairs behind a closed door. So just to give you a sense for that kind of powering time. As I mentioned before, the process of actually setting the system up is a little bit more efficient than I've found with some of the other more traditional analog UHF systems. So the first thing you need to do is run a scan. You do that on the receiver. Once you've run a scan, it can actually walk you through it and do it in a pretty automated sort of fashion. So it'll choose a frequency for you. You then hold the transmitter up to the receiver. There's a little infrared port there. It sets the same frequency on the transmitter, and you're good to go. Here's a big difference between UHF systems and 2.4 gigahertz, especially the consumer systems. And that is you can run a lot more channels of wireless audio. So in this case, for example, per 44 megahertz band, which is each of the transmitters come in a 44 megahertz tunable band, you can run up to 32 channels. Now, that's in an ideal world. I think in a real world, depending on how close to an urban environment you are and how much other RF activity there is in those UHF bands that you're using, I would probably say you could probably safely use 16, again, it really depends on where you're at, but up to 32 are possible. So what I have found with the 2.4 gigahertz systems is once you get past 2, maybe 4 channels, things start to fall apart pretty quickly. So again, if you're going to do a high channel count, this is where a UHF system like the SLX-D makes a lot more sense. Now, with the introduction of the SLX-D system, what's really great about it is that at the time of launch here, it also has a variety of different options. So you can get a single or dual channel table or rack mountable receivers. There's a handheld and body pack transmitters, and with the handheld transmitters, like the little dynamic microphone transmitters, you can purchase a whole series of different capsules for it from the Shure lineup, so you get a lot of different options depending on what type of sound you want. Now, of course, with the body pack transmitter, it does have a 4-pin TA4 male port, so any lavalier or headset microphone that you can terminate, and actually in this case here, for example, I'm using a TL47 twinplex, Shure twinplex lavalier, and it had a microdot connector, and so I just had to get the microdot to TA4 connector, and we plugged it in and we're good to go. There's also a rich existing ecosystem of other products that you can add on to improve the system here, for example, depending on your circumstances. So if, for example, you need an antenna system or an antenna distribution system, those are available. Of course, you also have the different capsules for the microphone, the handheld microphones that I mentioned before. There are rechargeable batteries and charging docks. So if you're running events, for example, for corporate video or an event like a conference, and you're going to be switching between people throughout, and you might have an hour at lunch where you can recharge the batteries. Not that you necessarily need to unless it's a 14-hour conference, but it's just really convenient that you can keep things charged up and ready to go without a lot of hassle. One thing that's important to consider with digital wireless systems is that because they are converting the audio from analog to digital, there is a latency involved. And the longer the latency, the more noticeable it becomes. So for example, some of the wireless systems in the 2.4 gigahertz range, the more consumer-oriented ones, have a latency of about 19 milliseconds. That's not unusual at all. And that actually is noticeable. So if you have a wired microphone plugged into your recorder, plus you have one of those 2.4 gigahertz wireless mic systems plugged in, the audio will be quite a bit out of sync between the two, 19 milliseconds in difference actually. And so having a 3.2 millisecond latency is much easier to work with. You don't have those issues. And really, for human perception, generally you can't tell until you get to about the 10 millisecond range. So 3.2 milliseconds is quite good. The receivers are really ruggedly built. That's one of the things that I really like about them is that they're a full metal box. They have a 15-volt DC input. They come with an AC adapter, but if you wanted to run it on a cart in a rack, you could do that as well. And another thing that's really nice about it is the OLED screen is nice and large. It's easy to read. The controls are very easy to use. The button and kind of scroll wheel are integrated into one, so it's just very intuitive and easy to work with. The body pack transmitter, which I'm using here, has a plastic body, but the plastic seems very high quality, so it seems like it's really kind of built to stand up over time. What I like about it as well, it's about the same size as a Sennheiser G4, roughly, maybe a little bit taller. Almost exactly the same size as my audio limited A10 system. So It's a pretty decent size, and I like that it has very rounded corners, and that makes it so that it doesn't catch on things as much, and it's a little easier to hide without leaving really obvious bulges. Another nice thing about it too is that it has recessed buttons, so it's very difficult for the person that's wearing it. And this happens a lot in corporate video where people just aren't paying attention. They're not familiar with this kind of technology necessarily. And so a lot of times I find people kind of start monkeying around with things. It's nice that the buttons are kind of off on the side and they're recessed, so it's not easy to bump them. You can also set several of the settings from the receiver, so that gives you some control as well. So for example, setting up the gain, you can do that from the receiver, which is super nice because that can be a pain if you put a body pack transmitter on somebody, they go off, and then you realize, oh no, that's way too low or that's way too hot. You can do that directly from the receiver, just adjust that. So really nice feature there. Now, no product is perfect, and you have to understand I'm coming from the perspective of someone who generally uses a more pro-level wireless system, so I'm working with the Audio Limited A10 system. A couple of things that come across as a con potentially for some people, although it's not going to affect everybody. Number one, there's no AES digital output from the receiver, so it is taking the audio in the transmitter, amplifying it, converting it to digital, sending the digital signal, and then at the receiver, it converts it back to an analog signal. And then that goes, of course, into your recorder or your PA system or whatever you're using. So for recording, in theory, that could degrade the signal, but overall, I found it still holds up very, very nicely. So it hasn't been an issue for me. One question that I think people that are familiar with the Shure wireless systems will ask is, can you use Wireless Workbench? It's an application you can run on a computer that allows you to do frequency coordination and things like that. This is not compatible with that, so you have to move up to the next Shure system to get that compatibility. But again, this isn't really designed for those circumstances. It's not designed for massive, huge installations, more of the smaller scale kind of installations. And then if I'm being really nitpicky here, one last thing on the body pack transmitter, it does not appear that the antenna is user replaceable. So if it does break, you would have to send that in. Now, I'm not too terribly concerned about it. It seems like it's really high quality. There's some strain relief on there, so I'm not too worried about it, but it is nice on my A10 system, for example, if something breaks, I can actually just replace it myself. Now, a couple of notes here. These aren't really pros or cons, but again, this is not a bag system. It's not going to go on top of your camera because the receiver is so much bigger. So just need to call that out so that people don't get mad at me for saying, why are you even talking about this wireless system? One thing that I think can come across as a con for people is that the power output settings on the body pack transmitter are at low 1 milliwatt and at high 10 milliwatts. That comes across and sounds like it's very low, like, man, that's a weak system and you can't get very much distance out of something like that. It seemed to perform really, really well. I put it through the acid test of doing an outdoor distance test without a lot of other things around. I generally find that wireless systems work better indoors. Once you go outside where there's nothing else out there, the signal just kind of goes out. I find that's one of the better stress tests, and this held up extraordinarily well. We got our first dropout at about 100 meters. So for me, I think for most of my corporate video work, this should hold up very nicely. Of course, we'll have to follow up and tell you what my actual experience is once the pandemic's over and we start shooting again, but overall, it's looking very promising. So there's a look at the SLX-D wireless system from Shure. I hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.